Okay. It should go
Tell me when we're up and running.
That's us.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this online discussion session for our Diverse Forages project. I hope you've all had a chance to review some of the videos that have been prepared in advance of this discussion session and published through YouTube. So we've already provided some background to the project, but just to remind you that this has been a 5-year project funded by the BBSRC through SAREC, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Innovation Club. And we're very pleased by the success of the project. It's been a substantial undertaking, a lot of hard work. It's been a multidisciplinary project involving collaborators from a number of institutes and cooperation of farmers who have participated in the project as well. So we're pleased to be sharing the results with you and pleased to be having the opportunity today to discuss those results with you. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. I believe you should be able to see the PowerPoint slide welcoming you to the event. We're going to have the panel give a brief introduction in just a moment. We've arranged for this session to last for about an hour and a half. You will, as attendees, will remain muted throughout the session, so you'll need to ask your questions through the Q&A function of this team session, and so that's you can access that by clicking the highlighted toggle at the top of your screen. It's the question bubble with it's the bubbles with the question mark in them. And then when you submit your questions, we'll then have access to them, and then I will direct them to the person that is best placed to answer that question. So if you want to ask a specific member of the panel a question, then be sure to include their name in your question. We do have a Tom and a Tommy, so perhaps include surnames. We also have 2 Sams, so please include surnames if you're asking specific one of our Sams or one of our Toms/Tommies a question. So yes, that's I guess how we're gonna do things today. I will chair the session and take your questions and direct them to specific individuals. I think what we thought we'd do initially would be to have each of our panel members give a very brief introduction to them to themselves. And so I'll start. I'm Chris Reynolds. I'm Professor of Animal and Dairy Science at the University of Reading and Director of our Center for Dairy Research. And I was the overall lead on this project. And I'll next ask Dave Humphreys to introduce himself.
Hi, Dave Humphreys. I'm a researcher at Reading University. My main role in the project was being involved with the establishment, the management and the research on the 20 hectares of multi-species swards we had here at the Centre for Dairy Research. So I was involved in the growing and management and grazing of mixed species swards for since 2016.
Thank you, Dave. Sam Lane? I almost forgot to say Lane.
Hi there, Chris. Thank you. Yeah, my name's Sam, technical manager at Cotswold Seeds, and within the project, we've been a sort of industry partner, I guess, advising on multi-species Leys, something we've dealt with for a long time. So we're pretty comfortable with mixing different species, grasses, legumes, and herbs. From my point of view, it's been really good to see the way we've teased out more of the science and the data behind these diverse mixes.
Thank you, Sam. Tom MisselBrook?
Yeah, good afternoon all. I'm Tom MisselBrook. I'm with Rothamsted Research, based at the Northwick Research Station down in Devon. And my role in this project was to lead on the modelling work, looking at the impact on emissions and nitrogen cycling of the introduction of diverse forages. Yeah, so looking forward to the discussions. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Next, Hannah Jones.
Hello, I'm Hannah Jones from the Farm Carbon Toolkit. I was part of this project as a member of staff of the University of Reading, and I worked closely with Duchy College. My role was to lead on the farmer trials, and I worked with Sam Walker, had the honour of sampling his fields. Yes, I was involved in the trial work at one of the 4 sites at Duchy College.
Thank you, Hannah. Tommy Boland, please.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks very much for an invitation to join the panel discussion this afternoon. I'm Associate Dean for Research, Innovation and Impact in University College Dublin in School of Agriculture and Food Science, and I'm also a Professor of Animal Science. I spent a number of years working with multi-species swards in dairy, beef and sheep production systems, and while not a part of the project being discussed this afternoon, have been working on a number of parallel projects here in Ireland over the last decade or so.
Thanks, Tommy. Yes, we benefited quite a bit from your experience with the Smartgrass project in setting up our project. So thanks for joining us today. Next, Paul Muto, please.
Hi, I'm Paul Muto. I work for Oliver Seeds as the Regional Business Manager for the Northeast. It's a relatively new role for me. I've just been in it for 6 months. Prior to that, I worked as Senior Specialist in Grassland Agronomy for Natural England, where I was primarily involved with our Herbal Ley option. I've long been interested in the challenge of diverse mixtures and the specific challenges of how to establish and manage more complex mixtures.
Thanks, Paul. And finally, last but not least, Sam Walker.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me along. I'm not sure what I can bring to the party. I'm just a tenant farmer. I was previously very near Duchy College when Hannah set me up with the diverse forages trial, and I was growing, well, mainly sort of varieties of Herbal Ley on sort of cold, wet fringes of Dartmoor. I've since moved to East Devon, a very different farm, sandy soil, much drier climate. I've done a few trials here, and actually I've just bought in the last few years several acres of just sort of various varieties of Herbal Ley and mixed them up, and it seems to be going well. I haven't got any graphs or data, but anecdotally, I've got a lot of anecdotal evidence that the cows love it.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, we look forward to your contributions today, very much so. So I guess what we thought we'd do initially, before we started answering specific questions, was to ask members of the project team if they could provide us with their thoughts on what they thought was the most important or perhaps the most surprising finding from the study. And I don't know who to pick on here, but Hannah, you were part of the project team. Would you mind kicking off, please?
Yes, of course. Yeah, happy. I'll do that. So probably what I found particularly interesting was the change in the composition of the Herbal Leys over time. So what you may sow in the first year and see in the sward at the end of that season will be potentially very different to what you end up with in year 3. And it's the combination of the management, the environment, which includes the weather and the soil type, as well as the grazing or cutting, that will influence that, as well as potentially changes in the soil structure and the soil health. So it's sort of unpicking individual species and how competitive they are within the sward under a particular set of variables, which I found particularly interesting. I also, it's not presented, but the worm, there was some interesting data coming out from the worm counts and worm mass in the fields. So there's a huge range of additional functions that Herbal Leys can achieve that sort of stretch into sort of soil health as well, and other aspects such as reducing leach nitrogen and such, which I think are fascinating. I suppose what I found so surprising was related to one of the comments, particularly from Sam Walker, about the livestock behaviour. It's how they favoured, in many cases, the herbal Leys, and it's just sort of trying to capture why they were favouring the herbal Leys, what aspect of that forage they particularly liked, which was very surprising and very interesting to observe. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. We may come back to that comment from or that observation from Sam in due course. Who next? Dave, do you want to pitch in anything here?
Yeah, hi. A couple of things really. The maintenance of comparable levels of production in the multi-species swards that we had compared to perennial ryegrass, especially as this was in the absence of any nitrogen fertilizer applications. So over our almost 5 years of managing the herbal swards, we had, for the mixed species swards, we had no cost of nitrogen fertilizer purchase and no cost of application, so machinery, fuel and labour. And the other aspect was the ability of the mixed species swards to recover and the changed species dynamics following periods of stress, such as drought. We had quite a challenging couple of years here in 18 and 19 with particularly dry weather. And this made management of the swards interesting and quite involving.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Tom, MisselBrook.
Yep, that's fine. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, my first one was the same as Dave, really, in terms of the diverse forage swards yielding, as well as the perennial ryegrass with nitrogen. And for those that have seen my presentation on the modelling aspects and the impacts, we couldn't model that. You know, our model suggested that the yields would be lower. So you know, we've obviously need to learn something about the processes that are going on there and improve our models. So yeah, that was a surprise and kind of implies that these aren't necessarily just for you know, extensive type low yielding type systems. So I think that's good to explore that a bit more. The other thing was just the interest that this project generated. I think that was well, it was a surprise. I mean, it's fantastic and it's really good, but I think just the number of farmers that really are interested in this, you know, Sam is evidently one of those, was fantastic and for many different reasons, I think, you know, and that again is interesting to explore why people are interested in using these diverse forages.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just from my perspective before we move to our industry partners, but you know, I sort of went into this project expecting that the yields of the diverse forages would be lower and the nutritive value might be lower. That was partly based on a previous DEFRA funded project we had been involved with, where we used a conservation mixture as one of our forage treatments, and we did see lower methane yields, but we had let the swards become perhaps more mature than we should have to try to maximize the amount of the grass alternatives in what we harvested, and so the grass that was there was more mature, and so I sort of went into it with a mindset of we might lose some production but gain some benefits in terms of reduced nitrogen use, fertilizer use, and increased biodiversity. But that's not what we found, as you would have seen from our presentations. We actually found, even in the last year of the study, albeit in dry conditions, that the mixtures in the agronomy plots outproduced the perennial ryegrass that was receiving nitrogen fertilizer. That wasn't true on every site. That was the average across all the sites, and that's also very important to remember that there was quite a bit of variation from site to site. Site did have a significant effect, but the overall effect was that the multi-species swards performed as well or better than the perennial ryegrass. And steer growth rate, as Dave talked about in his presentation, was similar across all the treatments, and we continue to see a reduction in methane yield or methane per unit dry matter intake from the animals. So that was quite good to see. Sam Walker, do you want to add anything as one of our participatory farmers? You participated in some of our workshops, and we also got some really useful data from your farm. And it's interesting, Hannah's comment about how much your animals preferred. Well, the implication was that the palatability of the swards was very good. Do you want to comment on that, or anything else?
Yeah. Oh, good. Sorry, just checking my microphone's working. I mean, this is purely anecdotal, okay? Because I haven't been too scientific. I was, as I said, in a council farm quite near Duchy College, and I was teaching at Duchy College as well. So, strip grazing, herbal lays, and it comes to sort of dark in the evening, and you've just got back from the college, and you've got to go and move the electric fence. And obviously, being a poor council tenant, I could only afford one electric fence, so I couldn't do what clever people do and put another one out in front and then roll up the last one. Bullets go in. So I thought I'd distract them. Right, these were fattening bullets. Give them a bit of cake. They love cake. They do anything for cake. They jump fences for cake. They break out of pens for cake. Give them a nice trough of cake. And while they're choffing on that, I'll go and sneak down and move my fence. It doesn't really work like that. They're so keen on the herbal lay, they eat their cake, and then one of them looks up and goes, "Hey boys, move!" He's moving the fence, and that's it. Boom. You're there in the dark, up to your waist in lovely herbal lay, tangling around an electric fence with a load of bullocks. And I've never seen that anywhere else. And it wasn't bad cake I was feeding them or anything like that. It was purely that appetite for it. And here at my farm in East Devon, we move the cattle down the road, and I've got various bits of old permanent pasture. They're all nice, they're all in good order. When you move the cows down the road towards where the herbal lay is, you need about 3 people to turn them into the field of permanent pasture halfway down, because they know where they're going and they're keen. I'm afraid this isn't data and I haven't got any graphs, but this is sort of what I'm seeing. If that's any use to the discussion.
Oh, it is. Thank you very much. Sam Lane, do you want to add anything in terms of, for I know Cotswold Seeds, your company's had a lot of experience with herbal lays, but would you like to add anything in terms of this project, perhaps, and what we've learned from this project?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. It's really interesting. I deal with a lot of farmers day to day, sort of at the sharp end, I guess. And over the last 3 or 4 years, even though we're starting to see the benefits of these sorts of mixes, a lot of people are still slightly dubious of them. And I think there's a bit of an element of thinking they are going to be lower production, lower yielding, a bit more like a sort of wild flowery meadow thing. So again, to have sort of data that shows there's some comparability with ryegrass even receiving nitrogen, to me is just a really, really useful source of information to say that they are productive, they will do what we know they'll do, but it's getting that across to people. And that, yeah, at the moment, I think there has been quite a lot of doubt about that, to say how productive they could be. So it's really useful. And again, especially with nitrogen being where it is now, I think it'll bring these low input systems into the focus even more.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. In that regard, can I, if you don't mind, Paul, I'm going to go to Tommy Boland first, in terms of our guests, from outside the project per se, and for their thoughts, but and particularly relative to what Sam was just saying, Tommy, because when I've talked to yourself and other colleagues in Ireland, what I hear is that the multi-species swards are outperforming the ryegrass in terms of weaning weights, in terms of days to finish, et cetera, et cetera. So would you like to add anything? And could you perhaps comment on that in terms of the productivity overall of the multi-species swards?
Yeah, Chris, and if I blather on too much, don't feel like you can't tell me to shut up or stop me at any stage, because we've collected a reasonable amount of data, and most of what I'm going to talk about for the moment would be around beef and sheep production systems. So in our most recent set of results, so what I'm going to describe now we've kind of zeroed in at the moment on a 6-species mixture as our multi-species mix of choice, which contains perennial ryegrass, timothy, red clover, white clover, chicory and plantain. And that's working across our beef and our sheep systems at the moment. With our ewes rearing lambs, last year when we weaned those lambs, and essentially every ewe was rearing 2 lambs, the weaning weight of the individual lamb was 4 kilograms heavier for the ewes that were fed multi-species swards compared to ewes which were fed perennial ryegrass sward. In the most recent set of beef studies, where we have taken Hereford steers from the dairy herd, introduced them to our experiments at about 12 to 13 weeks of age, and carried those animals through to slaughter weight to produce a 315 kilogram carcass. The cattle fed the multi-species sward were slaughtered about 55 days earlier than the cattle fed the perennial ryegrass sward. That was in our most recent set of results. When we averaged that out over 2 years, you know, we're looking at about a 30 to 40 day advancement of slaughter date to the exact same level of finish and the exact same carcass weight with our multi-species animals compared to our perennial ryegrass animals. Our multi-species swards do receive some fertilizer nitrogen. So our multi-species swards, they're stocked, all our swards are stocked at 2.5 livestock units per hectare. Our multi-species swards are receiving 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per annum, and our perennial ryegrass swards are receiving 210 kilograms of perennial ryegrass, or 210 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per annum. And our multi-species swards are producing about 12% more herbage than our perennial ryegrass swards, despite the fact that they're receiving about 40% of the fertilizer and nitrogen application rates. We do have a perennial ryegrass and white clover treatment in that experiment as well with the beef cattle, and the perennial ryegrass white clover results are actually very close to the multi-species results. So we've consistently seen, and we've other experimental sites and other previous experiments, we're consistently seeing improvements in animal performance with beef and with sheep. If I might kind of revert to your question you asked your colleagues on the project, you know, what has surprised me most about multi-species swards, and there are a number of things again, but the quality of the silage we've produced from these multi-species swards in terms of the level of animal performance they're promoting. So at the moment we have you know, the first year's calves in the shed. They were housed. These were calves that were born in March 2021, February, March 2021. They were housed in early November 2021, and they're going to be turned out next week. The growth rate of the calves receiving the multi-species silage indoors is 50% higher than the growth rate of calves receiving the perennial ryegrass silage. And we were really, I suppose, wondering how these crops would conserve, how these multi-species swards would conserve. And don't get me wrong, we have got it very, very wrong at times as well and made very bad silage. But when we have made the silage correctly and when we've done our job correctly, as opposed to the multi-species sward doing their job correctly, we've done our job correctly, the animal performance levels on those silages has been very surprising to me. And then to move away from the animal performance, Chris, and again, please bear in mind what I said, tell me to shut up at any stage if I'm going on too much. But in some of our work, we have let these multi-species swards become very, very kind of tall and mature, and you know they're almost more akin to a multi-species forest than a multi-species sward. You know, chicory and red clover up over my head. I'm not particularly tall, but still, they were up over my head. And when you approach the field, and hopefully people can understand what I mean when I say this, you can actually hear the swards, because the swards are alive with biodiversity and with insect life. You can hear the insects buzzing and the pollinators buzzing around those swards. So again, I think Hannah mentioned it earlier around ecosystem services and alternative kind of services from the multi-species swards. We have a lot of data collected now at this stage to show that it'll increase invertebrate diversity, it'll improve botanical diversity, it'll improve water infiltration into the soils, it'll improve earthworm populations, earthworm activities, earthworm numbers, reduce nitrous oxide emissions as well from the system. So in addition to just growing more herbage and allowing our animals to grow faster, a huge number of other benefits.
Okay, thank you, Tommy. And I think I may come back to you with some questions. I've got some questions related to those improvements in performance, which it might be useful to discuss. But before I do, let's move on to Paul Muto. We'd welcome your thoughts, please.
Yeah, just not to reiterate what everybody else was saying, but I think what struck me the most about the implementation of Herbal Leys is that how farmers have adapted to managing. And I think the lesson learned is that you can get productivity without nitrogen. And the other aspect is the having to forego herbicides and the impact that's had. I think a lot of farmers may have been nervous not being able to rely on sprays that would knock out broadleaf plants. And I think what's happened is, as a result, we've recognized that there are a lot of spontaneous broadleaf plants that may also be beneficial for livestock, things like dandelion, things that would normally be sprayed out. But also weeds are an important indicator of your soil conditions. So by foregoing herbicides, you sometimes get a flush of weeds that may indicate soil imbalances or excess. I know, Chris, we've talked about chickweed before, where, obviously there's a surplus of nitrogen in the soil, often brings on flushes of undesirable weeds. So it's interesting to see how people have adapted to managing these without nitrogen and herbicide inputs, but also the information we're getting from that by looking at the diversity that appears once you forego relying on herbicides.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And I think we've had a question or two already about establishment, and perhaps Paul and maybe I might ask Dave and Sam Lane to come in on this, or anybody else. But just in terms of this issue we had with our plots at Cedar in terms of chickweed during the establishment phase, and some, how do we deal with some of these challenges of dealing with, well, in our case, a flush of chickweed when we were first establishing our research plots, and how we dealt with that, and any other advice we might have in terms of weed control might be useful. And then I'll come back to establishment more generally. So Dave, I don't know if you want to say anything about our chickweed experience. I never will forget it.
Yeah. The large paddocks we had were initially discultivated, and that's from ex-dairy ground that's just been used as a slurry disposal system for many years. So we had quite a weed bank of fat hen and chicory. So that was stale seed bedded by spraying off, discultivated, and the seeds were essentially broadcast onto the bare ground with an air seeder with a very light harrow, and then rolled in twice for establishment. Using techniques advised initially by Sam as much as we could with the equipment we had on the farm. But the first thing that it was very dry, so we established in the autumn, but we didn't get the rain to kick the seeds off before the temperature started dropping a bit. But the chickweed grows a wee bit lower temperature than certainly some of the herbals. So we had a wall-to-wall carpet of chickweed almost without a break across 20 acres, so about 30 centimeters thick. And it's almost when you look at it, you think, well, let's plough it up and start again. But we topped it just to get the light into the base, and we left it over winter. And once the herbals were still there underneath, and the grasses, and in the spring everything got going, and within a month of growth starting, you wouldn't have known you'd have ever had a chickweed problem. It just died away and was outcompeted from then on. The only problem we had with chickweed once the mixed species were established was in the perennial ryegrass, which really we didn't use herbicides, so we got a lot of weed ingress back into the perennial ryegrass swards. but it was outcompeted once the mixed species swards got going, and we didn't have a significant weed problem over the 5 years of the project. We had dominance problems as we were swinging from wet to drought. So cocksfoot became a wee bit dominant at times, and broadleaf plantain became a wee bit dominant in certain of the areas. We've got a very free draining, very dry gravel soil in parts of the ground. So cocksfoot and plantain seem to like that. So apart from mixed species dominance, then we didn't have a weed problem after the first year, but it looked terrible following establishment, you know. But we stuck with it. We just topped it, and then we didn't really apply any physical management beyond grazing beyond that point. And when we took them out last autumn, after just over 5 years, they were still going great. We gave the mixed pastures back into the farming system. We borrowed the paddocks essentially, so we were unable to keep them going once the project finished. Yeah, so that was my experience of it anyway.
Thank you, Dave. That's really helpful. Sam Lane, do you want to say anything more about establishment? We did have a specific question about recommendations for establishment.
Yeah, I think there's a few things, Chris, and I always have to remember with all the conversations I have every day, not to forget the simple bits sometimes. So, for example, sowing time in the spring, not sowing too early when it's cold, as Dave said. Chickweed especially, but also other weeds seem to germinate quicker than our Leys sometimes when it's a little bit cold soil temperature. So letting things warm up, our seeds then hitting the ground running, as it were, and getting up and away, rather than having a sort of sprinkling of weed seeds already there that the Ley has to try and compete with straight away. And of course the same in the autumn of not going too late, when again the weeds seem to keep going that little bit later into the autumn than the cloves especially, and all the rest of them. So simple things like going into warm soils, whether it's spring or autumn, is the key. I've had a few very panicky phone calls about weed issues. We know perennials can be problematic. There's no two ways about that. But sometimes I think people forget that, as Dave said, annuals can be dealt with. Charlock, fat hen, for example, mowing or topping once or twice during that establishment 6 months, and they can just be dealt with, they're gone. And people look back after a year and think, what were they panicking about? So again, it's sort of just almost calming people a little bit and saying, right, what is the weed issue? Is there a very easy way to deal with it? That it looks horrible at the time, but it can be sorted. And then finally, I think, again, to back Dave up really with the idea of when he looked back in the following summer, didn't realise or didn't look like the chickweed had been an issue. This idea of writing crops off, especially autumn sown things, or giving them enough time for soils to warm in the spring to get up and get away and compete with whatever the weed issue is. You know, so this time of year, early March, we will get conversations where people think the crop hasn't taken, the seeds haven't taken. Actually, they just need some consistent warm weather to get up and get away properly. So it's sort of not rushing to say it's a failure as well.
Okay, thanks, Sam. And any thoughts in terms of other approaches for establishment or intersowing, anything like that?
Yeah, we have more and more conversations about direct drilling these mixes, the more diverse mixes. I think a lot of caution is key. We've got to be so careful about seed to soil contact and depth as well. Anything more than 10 mil, we can lose things. I've probably seen on one hand the really good results from direct drilling into stubble. I've seen a lot worse ones where the machine hasn't been set up right, or we haven't had the seed to soil contact. So there is a word of caution when we come to strictly direct drilling. I think it's a little risky.
Okay, thank you. And Sam Walker, what about from your own experience? Anything else you can add?
Yeah, I mean, my one concern, I appreciate Sam's advice, I appreciate anyone's advice on this. My old farm, where I established Herbal Leys, was an ex-dairy farm. I look at the sustainable farming incentive that's coming out now, and there's big incentive to have a certain amount of your pasture in Herbal Leys, which is probably very good news for Cotswold seeds. Docks. It was an ex-dairy farm. It had been dairied to death. It had been a slurry dump, as Dave was saying. And docks were an absolute bloody nightmare. I think annual weeds, I mean, I'm organic now at this place, and annual weeds, I can deal with annual weeds. Annual weeds are not a problem. Docks, though, I really struggle to get on top of docks at the old farm. Unfortunately here, although I'm organic, we don't have a dock issue. So it wasn't a problem. Everything else I can deal with, it's just docks. And if we're looking at establishing diverse forages in, predominantly obviously grazing fields, and probably the most hammered grazing fields would be the ones you'd reseed. Docks would be my one concern, if anyone else has got anything to add on that.
Okay, thank you. Paul, do you want to come in?
Yeah, it's certainly the one bit of feedback that I get quite a bit is farmers are particularly nervous about docks, particularly in dairy areas where soils are quite enriched. And yeah, there's no simple answer to that. I mean, I have seen farms where they allow the dock beetle to establish, and that will over time help to control the population, but the dock beetle isn't present or in high enough densities in all parts of the country to really rely on that as a control measure. Perhaps some aspect of mixed grazing might work, but there's no easy answer for that one.
Okay, thank you. Hannah, did you have your hand up? Yeah. Please, you're on mute, but please come in.
Sorry, I should have got used to it by now. Just with some of the farmers I've worked with where docks have been an issue, with the Herbal Leys, again, kind of anecdotal, I guess, which would be interesting to hear everybody's point of view. Docks have been managed by back fencing and just leaving the cattle there for another hour or two. And I don't know whether it's the sort of visual effect of the chicory and the dock alongside each other that it avoids some sort of cherry picking, so to speak, or whether because the growth habits of the chicory and the dock are very similar, the deep tap root and the broad leaves. In some situations, the farmers have just said, well, actually, over time, the docks get eaten, taken out, and there might well be an issue or a change in the soil structure. So docks are favoured by compacted soil. So as the soil becomes more fungal dominated over time, and whether this sort of competitive advantage of the docks actually drop. So I think such a system may work in a beef system, for example, but if it's used as a dairy grazing platform where such tight grazing patterns might not be possible, I guess you're less able to control those docks.
Thank you, Hannah. We've had a question about water infiltration rates. Sorry, and we did measure some water movements in some of our plots. I don't want to put Sarah on the spot. We've got a PhD student, Sarah Shepard, who's helping out today, and she's using some of that data for her dissertation, but I'm not sure that we're ready to comment on that. But it wasn't measured on all of our plots, but we did measure some of that in some of our sites, especially at Sonning, where we had the dry versus wet versus normal site. Tommy raised his hand. I think, Tommy, you may have done that in some of your work there in Ireland. Tommy, you're on mute. Are you there?
Yeah, just trying to unmute here.
We can hear you.
Yeah, the system's a bit slow to respond to the mouse clicks, or maybe I'm a bit slow to click the mouse. I'm not sure which. Like your own team, our team was multidisciplinary as well, Chris. So we had people on board from soil science perspectives, and they had measured water infiltration rates across our various multi-species swards, our ryegrass monocultures, and our ryegrass white clover swards. And I'm not able to quote the percentage increases to you now at this stage, but water infiltration rates were increased on the multi-species swards compared to the perennial ryegrass sward, and they were also, if I recall correctly, increased on the perennial ryegrass and white clover swards. So Ola Schmidt, who's our expert here within the school in terms of earthworms, there's a very strong relationship between legume presence in the sward and its ability to support earthworm population. So the more legume you have in the sward, the greater the earthworm populations in the soil. and at least part of that water infiltration improvements were being put down to the increased porosity of the soil due to the earthworm activity and the burrowing activity, but also due to the deeper rooting nature of some of the plants in the multi-species swards, which were again physically making channels for that water to gain access to the soil.
Okay, thank you, Tommy. That's really useful. Tommy, while you're live, if you can hear me, we've had a specific question for you, and I was going to follow up on this myself, but you mentioned that the perennial ryegrass white clover gave results in terms of productivity that were nearly as good as the multi-species sward. So, do you think the clover is the key driver species in this, and you know, what's the additional benefit of any of the plantain and chicory and some of the herbs?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chris. So I'll break it into our two species we focus on with sheep and with cattle. So with sheep, we see additional performance benefits with the multi-species sward over and above those which we've recorded with perennial ryegrass and white clover. Okay. So sheep do better on the multi-species compared to perennial ryegrass, white clover. With our beef cattle, thus far, the animal performance benefits that we're seeing are almost mirroring one another with the multi-species sward and the perennial ryegrass, white clover. There is probably, you know, there might be a week to 10 days earlier finish with the multi-species sward compared to the perennial ryegrass, white clover. But over a full 2-year system, you know, that's a very marginal difference. But so far, all we've looked at there is the growth rate of the animals. So, you know, so how long has it taken those animals to reach slaughter weight? What we're doing now is we're starting work looking at enteric methane emissions. We're looking at the parasite burden of those animals. And again, that is something we have recorded very strong results on with our sheep systems, where the systems containing the herbs have had a much lower requirement for anthelmintic administration to control intestinal parasites. And, you know, there are huge challenges here. I suspect it's not too different in the UK with terms of anthelmintic resistance, and now with actually getting access to anthelmintics and how they're prescribed and how they're administered and the efficacy. We're also looking at meat quality. You know, so potentially there are impacts of the different herbs in the sward on meat quality. Potentially impacts, I think, again, Hannah alluded to this, around nitrate leaching from the system and also nitrogen metabolism within the animal. So I certainly would be very much, you know, keen to maintain the herbs in our swards. I don't think we have enough evidence or enough data at this stage to say grass legume is enough, and that we don't need to look at including chickweed, plantain, or the other herbs within the mixtures.
Thank you, Tommy. And I know, you know, Sam Lane in his presentation highlighted some of the benefits of some of the herbs in terms of their mineral content. And, you know, you mentioned nitrous oxide, you know, in terms of inhibitors of nitrous oxide, you know, that are contributing to a reduction in nitrous oxide emission from our swards. Some of that's coming from some of our herds as well, and some specific chemicals, the root exudates, are present in the root exudates. Hannah, you've got your hand up. Please pitch in.
Turn my microphone on first. I'm a fast learner. Yeah, so a couple of our participatory farmers for this project were not buffer feeding over the summer, where they were grazing the Herbal Leys. So it's a sort of observation that is quite extensive in some of the farmers that I've worked with, that we all quite often talk about optimal forage quality, optimal growth rates, but actually when you're looking at economics of the system and the stresses of the system, some of those herbs, even though if you're looking at total yields, they might not be a huge advantage, but actually they may well be yielding when some of the perennial ryegrasses have given up for the summer. Thank you very much. So I think you need to sort of think about, you know, the grazing cycle and the variability. And I guess from the work that's been done at Sonning, comparing the very droughted plots and the very wet plots that Zoe talked about on our online webinar, you know, informs on that.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. And that leads very nicely into the next question, which relates to managing herbalise on wet ground, and perhaps and this specific question refers to water meadows. And I guess we went into the project wanting to look at our herbalise mixtures or our treatments in wet conditions, thinking that there might be some benefits to the deeper rooting, improved soil, water infiltration rates, et cetera, in terms of the wet sites. I guess we didn't really see a site by treatment interaction, so no suggestion that our mixtures gave any benefits compared to perennial ryegrass for a wet site versus a dry site, which was a bit disappointing. It's not what we expected. And the other thing we observed was that we had more weed ingress, as Zoe talked about in her talk, with some of our wetter sites, and especially Yorkshire Fog. So that leads to the question, and I'll probably pass this to Sam Lane, in terms of, is there any advice about managing herbalise on wetter sites? Should we use a different species mixture? Should we manage them any differently on a wet site?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Apologies, I think I lost you there for a little while. Had some technical issues.
No problem.
Pigeons on the wire. Yes, I think with the trial specifically, we didn't then break down mixes into wet and dry sites because we had the sort of 4 or 5 mixes anyway of different complexity. But for me personally, I tend to tailor the species in these mixes where possible to suit the soil type, whether it be particularly dry or wetter. We know things like Timothy, meadow fescue, maybe all-site clover work well on the wetter sites. I think plantain can struggle sometimes. Chickweed tends to do okay. So yeah, I think my message would be, if possible, try and tailor it to suit the soil type, because hopefully you should get stronger species there. And as you say, then less gaps, hopefully, for weed grasses to creep in. They do tend to like the wetter sites, definitely the sort of natural grasses, if you like. Okay,
thank you. And then there's another question back to the dock. We were discussing docks, so there's a question that's come in about dock management, and that is there an ideal defoliation time or interval to help reduce dock population, relative to seed set or anything like that? And maybe back to you, Sam.
Yeah, I think as Paul mentioned earlier, docks are a real tricky one. There's no silver bullet, that's for sure. Had a conversation the other day with a chap who seemed to think that the older dock plants could be sort of grazed into submission to a degree, where you were sort of using up more plant resources. It was the young ones, the seedling docks from the year before, that were really tricky. The small plants, they seem to have a lot more vigour in them. So if you have got more established dock plants, maybe they're the ones you could try and graze right down to the bare bones. I think part of this comes to site selection for the herbal Leys. They're not perfect. There is a weakness in terms of herbicide choice, definitely. So if we are putting these into areas that we know are going to be an issue, we've got to expect the docks to probably come through. Can we give ourselves enough time to try and deal with the dock population before sowing them multi-species forward? I know that's a bit of a perfect scenario, but I think timeliness and giving yourself enough time to deal with them beforehand is certainly not time wasted.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Here's another question pertaining to parasites. So I'll put this back to you, Tommy Bowland, over in Ireland. And the question is, why are intestinal parasite numbers reduced in sheep and not that much in cattle?
Well, I'm not sure I said there wasn't a reduction in cattle. Maybe, if I did, I apologise. We've seen reductions in sheep. An artifact of the way our animals come onto the farm basically means that we were using anthelmintics to control lungworm in those young calves, and the same anthelmintics to control lungworm will also control roundworm or intestinal worm. So we didn't actually have the capacity within that experiment to detect impacts on parasitism and parasite burdens in cattle. But there is lots of data from other studies showing that the presence of herbs and the use of multi-species swards will reduce parasite burdens in cattle as it will in sheep.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So questions come in about, and I think this pertains to grazing management. And you know, for our project, we chose to cut our trial plots using an approach that simulated grazing, but we removed everything, and we used an approach that was, you know, was the same for the perennial ryegrass as it was for the multi-species swards. So we used a 7 centimeter residual. We harvested when we got to about 2,500 to 3,000 kilograms. But I know Tommy, perhaps again back to you. You've done some more work, and we've had some discussions around recommendations for grazing management for multi-species swards and how that might differ from perennial ryegrass or perennial ryegrass white clover. Would you like to comment on that, and then I'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
I'm not sure if you can. Yep. Yeah. Still a few technical gremlins in the system over here on this side. Yeah. So I wouldn't be making. I suppose we haven't yet, Chris, established the blueprint for grazing multi-species swards the same way that we have that very well established blueprint for grazing perennial ryegrass swards. You know, and the rules for perennial ryegrass are probably much clearer and much more universally applicable than they are for multi-species swards. I'll maybe preface my comments by a couple of statements. We can certainly get away, if that's not the wrong term to use, we can certainly get away with much heavier covers. Excuse me, we can get away with much heavier covers of multi-species swards than we can with perennial ryegrass. So there's certainly, you know, evidence that the quality is maintained as the sward horizon increases in multi-species swards, much better than it is with perennial ryegrass swards. We would be inclined to go, well, not inclined. We're going for a 6 centimeter post-grazing residual with our multi-species swards, compared to a 4 centimeter post-grazing residual for our perennial ryegrass swards. And we've had many people tell us, you know, that 6 centimeters is much too low for a multi-species sward. And when I spent time in New Zealand with the team in Massey University, they had a post-grazing residual of their legume herb swards, which was 10 to 15 centimeters. And we're also attempting to extend the rotation length, so to give a slightly longer period of recovery. And there's no such thing as an average rotation length, and it's almost a meaningless figure in some ways. But if we talk about a 21-day rotation in perennial ryegrass, it's almost never achieved. But we'd be moving more towards a 27, 28-day targeted rotation length with multi-species swards. Now, I think it's very important that we bear in mind the actual composition of our sward when we're talking about our multi-species sward, what's going in there to make up that sward. If you're calling something that is perennial ryegrass dominated with 10 to 15% of chicory and or legume and herb in there, that's still pretty much a perennial ryegrass sward. So if you're going for long rotation intervals and high post-grazing sward heights, you're probably going to have been suffering some quality penalty there. Whereas if you have a lot of legume and a lot of herb in the swards, you're certainly much safer with those higher post-grazing residuals and your slightly longer rotation length. But again, the final thing I'll say is bear in mind you're trying to compromise the requirements of all those different plants and all those different functional groups in that sward. So you may not be doing what's best for any individual plant or individual species, but the overall sward performance is supported by your grazing management. Okay.
Dave Humphreys, do you want to come in on grazing management? In terms of, because I know you've worked with innovative farmers and some other projects relative to managing herbal Leys for dairy. Do you have any observations or any insights you want to share with us about grazing management?
Well, for the actual project, for the paddocks and the grazing, and to achieve grazing measurements, we were plate metering and moving fences and measuring height in and height out and sampling, etc. So it was quite a controlled grazing system and not dissimilar from a standard ryegrass approach, in that we had a height that the animals went in and the height the animals came out, and it was an intensive fence move daily system, because we were driven to obtain data for the project. but the multi-species swards performed perfectly well with that intensive approach. There were times when the multi-species swards got away from us, and as Tommy mentioned, it was more like a multi-species forest than a multi-species sward. And putting steers in there, you couldn't see them for a week or two until they'd nibbled their way down a bit, but they performed perfectly well, and they took it down surprisingly well back to a reasonable height if you gave them enough time to do it. Because initially we've come from a ryegrass system. The standard commercial operation here is ryegrass. So we were fairly tidy-minded as well, stripy and all evenly, an even height. So we did start with topping a wee bit at the start of the project, but we soon realised that was a waste of time, really, because the multi-species swards did reset over the winter, and the residual chicory stems, etc., gave some perching points for overwintering birds who seem to appreciate it. So there's also the other aspects of the multi-species swards that Tommy mentioned as well. The sound of it, the swarms of things as you walk through it that you don't get beyond the headland in the ryegrass fields. But the height of the herbals brings biodiversity into the centre of the field because there's more habitat there.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And yeah, I mentioned Sarah Shepherd earlier. She's measured some of these biodiversity effects for her dissertation, and so look out for that data. It'll be coming out soon. It's using our project platform for her dissertation. Sam Walker, do you want to come in there, please?
I haven't got a plate meter. I used to have a plate meter. I think I borrowed it from Dutchy College. And so this is completely unscientific, influenced by what I've seen at shows like Groundswell, sort of American mob grazing techniques. I've got very low organic matters in these soils. Okay, they're sandy soils, and believe it or not, we're in Devon. Yeah, it rains. We get big summer droughts. Quite often the herbal Leys is the only thing that's still going. If I let it get tall, if I let it get its roots down. I've been amazed at the speed of regrowth. If I go in and follow the old, mob grazing mantra of graze a third, trample a third, reject a third, looks like a terrible mess, move the fence, move them on, back fence them away from the bit they've just been in. I aim for a 28-day rotation. Entirely depends what time of year it is. There is never a 28-day rotation. Get a summer drought, it'll be a bit longer. Get a big growth spurt in May, it could be 21 days. Get to the sort of back end, could be 2 months. But one thing I've noticed is if you do strip graze them, what everybody does, or mob graze them, put them in by the gate, move the electric fence slowly until you're right across the far side of the field. Don't do it for too long, because by the time you want to herd them back out of the gate and go on to the next field, sometimes the regrowth, I'm talking about after a week or whatever, is so tender and so juicy that you have to push them out of the field to get them moving on a bit. But so that's just the way I take it, rather than measuring everything. Like I say, when I leave, it does look a mess. Quite interestingly, they reject the chicory when it gets woody. It goes to flower, and we've got a big colony of clouded yellow butterflies, which is drawing insect photographers from all around the place. So, there's various benefits, but it's not definitive science going on here, I'm afraid. I'll leave that to you guys.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Another question related to sort of grazing management and choice of residuals. What about the impact on the maintenance of the diversity of the sward? Or, are some species more sensitive to tighter grazing? Any thoughts on that? And I'll just throw that open to anybody that might want to pitch in there. Maybe I don't know, Sam Lane, if you've got any thoughts on that in terms of how how grazing management or even conservation management affects the maintenance of diversity.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think it does have a big effect, definitely. And to me, not grazing too tightly and the rest period, as Sam was saying, is key. That's what seems to keep the diversity in the swards. It's amazing how quickly these diverse swards can become ryegrass, white clover and a bit of timothy when they're overgrazed or grazed too regularly, too hard. And I think we've got to remember the shape of most of the species, the plant species we're putting in there, are pretty aerial. So to get that yield and forage growth, you've got to allow them to express themselves. Some people do get worried when they look at the sort of, I'd argue, extreme example of the real mob grazing trampling and all the pluses that can go with that. It doesn't have to be quite that extreme. You can sort of go and have a nice halfway house, still have a very productive, relatively normal looking sward. But if we treat it just like ryegrass, I think we are shortcutting the lay and everything else. We're not harnessing the benefits from the yield side of things. So to me, it's yeah, you're not doing it justice if you treat it like a ryegrass sward, and it can very quickly become undiverse, which is a real shame.
Okay. Anybody else want to pitch in on that one from your own experience?
Yeah, just real quick. I think what's really interesting about perennial ryegrass is how resistant to grazing it is. It's the one grass you can just absolutely defoliate repeatedly and it still thrives on that. However, nothing else really will. So in a sense, we've developed our reliance on perennial ryegrass by having systems that are grazed and regrazed often, and there's very few species that can tolerate that. And so the interest in having a mixed sward with lots of different species is you immediately have to ease up on that grazing intensity to allow these plants a chance to recover. And I think, yeah, grasses are probably the most resilient to grazing pressure. And as you move towards the herbs, they will be the first to disappear if the grazing pressure is too high. Yes, they will be grazed. They can tolerate some level of grazing, but I think it's also interesting that the species we use most in herbal Leys are ones that have a rosette growth form. So in other words, they hug the ground tightly like plantain and the growth point stays low. If the growth point gets elevated, those are the species that tend to disappear more quickly. So again, I think what's evolved with a lot of our herbal Leys is we're focusing on those broadleaf plant species that are adapted to grazing. But again, they probably won't be as adapted to grazing as something like perennial ryegrass.
Thank you, Paul. It raises, reminds me that a lot of the ryegrasses that we're using, they're varieties that have been developed for grazing, if you know what I mean. So we have a huge number of varieties available to us for some of those species, but especially perennial ryegrass. Whereas our variety choices are more limited for some of the other species we're wanting to put into these swards. And I just wonder if we should be looking at developing varieties of some of these other herbals, the forbs and some of the alternative legumes to develop varieties that are more resilient to grazing. I don't know. That's just a thought. Tommy, please come in.
Yeah, so Chris, we've done some work looking at the maintenance of diversity under different management, and to cut a long story short, we have lost diversity very rapidly in our mixtures when we're I think it was Sam that said, when we manage them as perennial ryegrass swards. When we apply the perennial ryegrass rules to multi-species swards, to diverse swards, we very quickly drive them in the direction of perennial ryegrass. And when you stand back and think about it for a few minutes, that makes sense because those management blueprints have been developed to favour perennial ryegrass. So you apply them to a mixture that contains perennial ryegrass, you're going to favour the perennial ryegrass mixture therein. We have noted better, I suppose, resilience of diversity under cutting than under grazing regimes as well. So there does seem to be an important factor there played depending on whether you're harvesting those swards with the animal directly or with a machine. So there are lots of questions which remain around the correct grazing management, and there are lots of schools of thought, as we've, there are differing opinions on the webinar here this afternoon as well, which is fantastic. But if we look at where the perennial ryegrass management blueprints have come from, and here in Ireland, there's been a huge amount of research invested into developing management blueprints for perennial ryegrass. So we've decades and decades of research telling us how to manage perennial ryegrass swards. we don't have that same volume of data or volume of information for multi-species swards. So we're kind of learning on the fly here a little bit, and there's a huge demand for that information now. And the other factor, I think, it's parallel to the discussion we're having here. In addition to a huge amount of breeding activity having taken place with perennial ryegrass and developing new varieties, that is an industry that has developed in parallel with cheap, readily available, and easy to apply nitrogen fertilizer. And my fantastic colleague, Professor Helen Sheridan, who got me into multi-species swards research about a decade ago now at this stage, she's always telling me, prior to the advent of relatively available nitrogen, perennial ryegrass was viewed as a weed in a lot of situations. So its development has been in parallel with nitrogen. And for all sorts of reasons, and hopefully many of them, particularly the situation in the east, are temporary, that nitrogen is A, no longer cheap, B, no longer freely available, and C, we're no longer free to apply it as we once were. So that's going to necessitate a change in direction and a change in approach.
Okay, thank you, Tommy. We've got a few more questions that have come in here. One was about the effect on yield of grazing versus cut and carry systems, and that's one thing that we need to qualify our agronomy work in our project, is that we just removed, we didn't apply any slurry or manure. The plots weren't grazed, so we took biomass off. We monitored soil fertility and adjusted if we needed to, but other than that, we didn't put anything back in. So this question is what would be the effect on yield of cut and carry versus grazing, or just using the plots for conservation, perhaps? Is there that? What is that? What is the benefit of having the dung and urine coming back onto the plots? And I don't know, Hannah, please.
Just down in the Duchy of Cornwall plots, no, Duchy College plots, sorry, down at Stoke Limson, by the third year, even though the P&K indices were fine, we were getting about 80% white clover in those mixes. So the use of the dung or the fertilizer, as Tommy's talking about, actually suppresses the legumes and gives a sort of competitive advantage for the grasses. So I think with nitrogen you can actually alter the ratios within your sward quite readily, and in a pure cut herbal Leys system, that problem is quite consistent in the southwest, where clover is very aggressive because of the warm, wet conditions, and so you need a bit of slurry to knock it back. And if you haven't got any slurry, use a bit of AN or something like that.
Thank you, Hannah. And just to say that our carbon nitrogen ratio results were different for our grazing plots than there were for our agronomy plots, and that's partly due to the fact that we had trampling going on and manure being returned by the animals. So another question, and this one specifically for you, Tommy Boland, would there be benefit in increasing the residual height as the season progresses? So in other words, if you've got more grass dominance in early in the season, using a shorter residual, and then maybe going to a higher residual by the end of the grazing season, would that help some of those herbal species?
I'm going to say potentially, Chris, because I don't have the data to support that answer, but certainly in one of our studies where we were going in a sheep grazing system to a 6 centimetre post-grazing sward height in the early spring, what we actually saw was that those swards essentially became grass dominated because the grass wasn't being set back by grazing to 4 centimetres, so grass really predominated in the spring part of the year. So what we ended up doing in that study was essentially all of those swards were subject to a silage cut in June or July, and that served to reset the swards, whereby the herbs got a chance to recover and the legumes got a chance to recover after that cutting regime. But by grazing it to 4 centimetres or to 6 centimetres in the spring, it actually kind of was counterintuitive and counterproductive for what we're trying to achieve. Now on the beef study, where we're grazing to 6 centimetres all along, those swards are probably in the region of 30% grass, dry matter contribution. Herb probably another 20%. I'm generalizing here across the season, and legumes making up 50% of the dry matter contribution in those swards. So again, at least our evidence would suggest that in the springtime, at least, be careful, and it's going to be dependent on which grazing system you're using, beef versus sheep.
Okay, thank you, Tommy. I've had a question come through about analysis, and this is one of the limitations we've raised in terms of our discussion around herbal Leys for our multi-species swards for our project. Can we apply NIRS, near infrared spectrometry, for analysis of conserved multi-species swards biomass? Just to say that at Reading we were part of a ASDB funded project where we did quite a bit of work on improving the NIR calibrations for grass clover mixtures, which we knew had some problems because the calibrations were based on grass alone, but were being applied to grass clover mixtures, and there was actually an update to the spectral equations based on that work. But I'm not aware of anybody that's looked at the validity of the NIR predictions for multi-species swards compared to wet chemistry. We talked about doing it for this project. We just didn't have the funds or the person power, to do the work. So I don't know if anybody else wants to pitch in on that. I think you would have some reservations about the results you get from an NIR analysis of a multi-species swards haylage, but I'm not sure if anybody's actually done that work yet to show. Tommy?
Yeah, we haven't done the work, Chris, and to answer your question, could you use NIR analysis for multi-species silage? You could, but it wouldn't mean very much because the results are entirely unreliable, in my opinion, and not wishing to offend anybody who's a proponent of NIR. And the reason I say that, when we conducted, I cited the example of those silages earlier on in this afternoon's discussion, when we look at the analysis we get back from NIR, and even indeed from our own wet chemistry in our labs in terms of the feeding value of those silages, the animal performance is much, much better than what the chemical analysis, or particularly the NIR analysis, is suggesting it should be. So we've essentially another 300 grams of growth per day coming from somewhere that is not explained by the chemical analysis of the silages we're seeing. So we're investigating that in more depth to see if that's an intake issue. Are we getting much higher intakes with these silages? And again, group level intake measurements would suggest no, we're not seeing a huge difference. So is it a utilization factor, or is there something happening perhaps post nutrient absorption at the digestive tract level that's driving a higher level of efficiency? But to go back to the original question, the NIR is not accurate in terms of explaining the level of animal performance we've been achieving from our multi-species silages.
Yeah. And that whole issue is compounded by the issue of wet versus dry sample analysis as well, which has historically been a problem. And I know some labs here in the UK have gone to dry analysis like the rest of Europe. And Tommy, I'll just follow up on that because that's really interesting. I was going to ask you about this, and we've had so many questions come in. I haven't done it. But yes, what explains the increase in growth rate? Based on our project's results, we did see some differences in nutrient composition that Zoe talked about in her presentation, where the nitrogen fertilized ryegrass had a higher protein concentration, and there were some differences in some of the fiber fractions as well. And also ash was different, and I always put that down, or I tend to put that down to some of the stems in the legumes and the multi-species swards being higher in ash, just like clovers and lucerne. They have a higher ash content, or certainly lucerne does. But the digestibility of those forages, certainly the cut and carry forages, so the fresh forage was similar. We saw a very similar digestibility. Nitrogen digestibility slightly higher as a percentage for the perennial ryegrass, but overall organic matter and dry matter digestibility was comparable. So where is that increased performance coming from? Have you, and I guess you've already answered the question by saying, you know, you couldn't attribute it to any specific differences in nutrient composition.
Yeah, and the short answer, Chris, and people might be realizing at this stage, I don't really do short answers. They tend to be more verbose than that. But the short answer is we don't know. We don't know where that performance difference is coming from, because when we look at the chemical analysis, we get estimates of intake. You know, there are modest differences there. I'm not saying they're identical. There are modest differences, but the differences are not, at least in our opinion, large enough to explain the big differences we're seeing in growth performance. So our next step is to do some in-depth animal intake studies, individual feed intake measurements, and digestibility measurements, and animal digestibility measurements in vivo, and nitrogen balance studies. You know, to see if there's something happening there at the nutrient digestion level in the animal with these forages. At the moment, we just don't know, or at least we don't know with certainty what's driving those differences.
Yeah, and in our studies, in terms of nitrogen utilization, no real significant differences in nitrogen balance, but we had similar growth rates. So, you know, for our treatments and the forages that we were working with those years, you know, they were comparable. So thanks, Tommy. There's a question here. What was the range in utilization rates in the low residuals treatments? I guess that's perhaps targeted for you again, Tommy. I don't know if you can see the question in the chat. Your mute button's still slow to respond. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, what we were getting utilization percentages with our low residuals, and again, I'm pulling data from 2014 and 15 here, so I may be a little bit inaccurate, but it was in the mid 80s% in terms of herbage grown versus herbage utilized with those kind of low residual levels. So again, and I should maybe say the first piece of work, which was the smart grass work, which you referenced earlier, Chris, this first piece of work with our multi-species sward in those studies, we were grazing those swards to 4 centimeters. So exactly the same grazing management rules as we had for our perennial ryegrass. And by the end of that 2-year study, from grazing those swards to 4 centimeters, we essentially had a ryegrass white clover sward with a little bit of plantain and a little bit of red clover in it. That's what we were left with.
Okay, thank you very much. There was a question I've been meaning to go back to. So it's if you guys are looking in the chat as well, and it pertained to let me see if I can find it. It was back to the discussion around DOC and control of DOC, and whether there was any potential for using P to K ratio in terms of helping to control DOCs. Does anybody have any thoughts on that one? Yeah, anybody looking at addressing soil P to K ratio or P to K balance to reduce DOC population? Any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I would stick my neck out on that one, but I think it's really interesting to look at the, you know, your cation balance and how that's impacting your plant population dynamics. It would probably get to be quite a complicated experiment to try to run. But yeah, I mean, there's some indicators that, you know, high phosphorus levels may be leading to, I mean, it's often on dairy farms where you get the issues with DOC dominance. So again, you're in those soils that have quite, you know, good or high phosphorus levels, as well as potash. So yeah, there's probably some underlying soil fertility issues that are impacting the weeds. How you'd go about adjusting your fertility management to manage for that is quite challenging.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? We're getting close to the end, so if anybody has any questions they'd like to put forward, please do right away. Tom MisselBrook, I'm gonna fire you a warning shot and ask you a question. I could sense you were a bit disappointed that the Spaxis model wasn't able to predict herbal ley performance or multi-species swards performance. Do you have any ideas about how you might be able to adapt those models so that they can, because I think, you know, I know you guys haven't focused very much on organic systems, but certainly, you know, I think the popularity of multi-species swards has definitely increased, and you know, I think there's going to be more and more uptake, and it might be. So, are you thinking you'll be able to adapt the model to accommodate multi-species swards?
That's a really good question, and the model was certainly developed around, well, initially around crops, in fact arable crops, and then it's been developed for grassland, but perennial grassland systems. So the data to parameterize, you know, to get the numbers you need in terms of nitrogen allocation within a plant, nitrogen uptake, and particularly for legumes, nitrogen fixation rates for different species, those kind of things. There's just not the data out there at the moment in order to improve the model, and that's where, you know, if we're moving into this multi-species swards becoming more mainstream. And I think, as people have already said, breeding of some of those different species specifically to improve them as well for you know, more productive agriculture. Then you know, those data will become available and we can improve the models. The other thing is the competitiveness between the species. That's really hard to predict without having a really big data set to explore and understand what's happening there, and transfer of nitrogen from legumes to non-legume species at different times of the season and so on. So I think one of the kind of question marks perhaps was, you know, there didn't seem to be enough nitrogen in the system to support the yields compared with the perennial ryegrass. Tommy's alluded to the fact that they do provide some nitrogen for their, you know, some of their mixtures, which kind of, you know, maybe that is an issue then. But also, you know, maybe because we established our swards from pretty productive grasslands to begin with, you know, there was perhaps a lot of residual nitrogen there that was being used in the first place. So although this was a 5-year project, and in terms of research funding, you know, that's pretty good. It's almost as good as we ever get. 3 kind of agronomy years is still relatively limited for competitive systems, you know, that are dynamic and are going to change over time. So we still need more information, I would say, to really develop these process-based models. So that was one thing, and yeah, I was, you know, slightly underwhelmed by our all of our modelling work in terms of impacts, particularly on emissions and so on. You know, it's not showing a great deal. There's, as has been discussed, there's many other reasons why diverse swards, species swards, are being used, and it's not about trying to reduce carbon footprint entirely. Although there are clearly some benefits, but maybe not as great, or we need more information to really justify some of the claims that are being made around that. But perhaps my question back to Sam Walker, for example, or Sam Lane, or some of those that are on the webinar, is where do we see these diverse species swards really being used? Our assumptions in the modelling were that high input, high output dairy systems really aren't going to be converting to these. Now, if the productivity is the energy really there for 8,000 plus litres per year dairy cows to operate on a diverse species sward? If not, it's more about the organic, you know, the 5,000 litre dairy cow farmers who probably mostly are on relatively organic systems, you know, converting from a grass clover system to a more diverse system. So in terms of impacts on carbon footprints and so on, that's perhaps why we didn't show such a big impact there. Beef and sheep, yes, I can fully understand a lot more of that going, but a question maybe directly for Sam Walker. You said you've got a field of or maybe more than one field, but you also hinted that you've got a field of perennial ryegrass. You know, would you put your whole farm down to diverse forages, or is it, you know, there's a particular reason why you have some fields in it and some fields in other things? I was just trying to understand the kinds of scenarios that we perhaps should be modelling for future systems.
Okay. Well, yeah, no, I'm not a massively intense dairy farmer. This is predominantly an organic arable farm. Like most organic arable rotations, I need to have a fertility building phase. I haven't got any nitrogen, all right, apart from what I can get out of the sky. There's a chap called Gabe Brown, you may have heard of, an American. He was quoted the other day saying, nitrogen, why the hell am I worried about nitrogen? I've got 34,500 tons sitting above every acre. All I've got to do is put in some clover and help myself. If only it was that easy, it'd be great. But I'm looking to build the organic matter. I'm looking to restore the soil and obviously fertility building. The only issue is I'm looking for something ideally that should be down for a couple of years. The 2 and a bit fields of Herbal Ley I've got going now, and also the Lucerne I'm growing. I like them too much. They're in too good order. It'd be vandalism to go in there after a couple of years. And when you consider the price of the seed and the fact you've got a good establishment, a good ley, they do tend to stick around for probably longer than they should. My other fertility building fields are far more standard Italian ryegrass and red clover. The reason they're not all on Herbal Ley is because I cut them for silage, and I was very interested with what Tommy was saying about making silage from Herbal Leys. That certainly ought to be something I'm looking at. I've got my own baler, I've got my own wrapper, you know, we bale lucerne and stuff, so it shouldn't be a problem making silage out of it. And yeah, I think I'll go for more. The permanent pasture I've got on my tents is only about 25 acres of it on the whole farm, and I can't plough that up. I wouldn't want to anyway, it's far too steep. So yeah, so that is very traditional permanent pasture with all the usual grasses you'd expect in it. And as I said, the rest of my fertility building is Italian ryegrass red clover mixtures, the standard sort of stuff. It's lucerne, which I've got a premium market for and I absolutely love. And it's the Herbal Leys. And now I know I can make silage out of Herbal Leys, I might go for a bit more. While I'm droning on, one other thing I've noticed, I don't know if anyone else has noticed, is if you ever try putting Aberdeen Angus cattle on these diverse forages, they shine. They look like guardsmen's boots. I've never seen such shiny black cattle. So there's got to be, you know, there's got to be bringing up minerals and things that, you know, normal grasses cannot supply. But again, I haven't got any data for that, so I'll shut up.
Oh, thank you, Sam. Hannah. Unmute, Hannah.
Sorry, did it again. For some of the farmers I work with, they will use different Herbal Ley mixes for different purposes. So for the cutting land, they will leave out the chickweed quite often because we can't get it sensibly dry after about May in Cornwall. So if they're cutting it multiple times, just leave out the chicory, and you can take that all the way through and do 3 or 4 cuts. There is a reliance on just using standard inoculants to get the decent sort of silage quality. Secondly, as just reflecting on what Sam Walker was saying, there's some farmers down here who have all Herbal Leys on their temporary pasture, and on some of their permanent pastures they might actually, particularly on steeper ground, they will actually use a rotor seeder and can seed in some Herbal Leys on those. And I think motivations, so my business is in carbon audits, carbon calculators, and moving towards net zero, and recent sort of estimates, depending on the environment, the soil type, carbon sequestration through soil organic matter and the microbial diversity below ground is enhanced under the Herbal Leys compared to standard perennial ryegrass white clover mix. So in the context of the carbon discussion, Herbal Leys have great merit in that particular debate. There have been some broad estimates of the relative increase, but we've got some trials running at the moment to find get some decent data on that. So it'd be interesting if anybody else has got some data on how much organic matter increase there is. It also has relevance when we're talking about water catchment areas. The reduction in leaching improves soil infiltration. So in some areas where there's local flooding, Herbal Leys may be used and recommended, for example, in Cornwall Wildlife Trust around some reservoirs. So that also has relevance on a landscape scale. And finally, I have some sort of relatively productive dairies who are using a herbal ley grazing platform, and we're collating data on rumination. And I think it's really important when we're thinking of the KPIs. Yes, yield is one. We've got to think about fats, we've got to think about proteins, we've got to think about date to first calving, we've got to think about all those and cull cows, the age, how many calves they produce. So it's not all about yield, and actually you need to look at the whole farming system to evaluate the relative scope of using herbal leys.
Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, and just finally with our project, we also had haylage treatments. We conserved forage from all of our treatments, and then did haylage feeding trials as well. And of course, you know, maturity at harvest will impact on haylage quality. That's really important. So, and it does make a big difference in terms of the digestibility of the haylage. I think we've run over time now, Zoe. Apologies for that. I think we need to draw this to a close. Can I just say, first of all, you know, this project and obviously the work in Ireland as well is producing a wealth of information and data, and we're working to start disseminating that information. This is part of that process. We'll be publishing it as well. But it's also highlighted areas of future research that are needed, which is really important as well. It'd be really nice to look at longer term impacts of these herbal leys, you know, or using them as more permanent pasture rather than as leys per se. And you know, our leys our leys were in for about 5 years. But it'd be really nice to look at longer term effects in terms of the impact on soil in particular. So thank you to everybody that joined us today. Thank you for all your questions and your participation. We really appreciate it. I think it's been really useful. I want to especially thank our panel today for taking the time to participate. Thank you to Tommy and Paul, who have sort of joined from outside the project in particular. I'd like to thank all the participatory farmers and especially Sam for joining today. But we really value your participation in the project. It's been really helpful. Thank Sarek for funding the project, and especially Cotswold Seeds, our commercial partner on the project, for all your contributions. It's been really helpful, Sam. So please thank all the colleagues, Paul and Ian and everybody else at Cotswold Seeds for their contributions. And then finally, a big thank you to Sarah and Holly for helping run this event today, and especially to Zoe for all her hard work on the project, pulling all the data together, and for organizing this dissemination event this week. We really appreciate it. So well done to everybody, and thank you very much. I think we'll draw it to a close then.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Bye-bye.